Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. It's called Teenage Wasteland, Addressing the Burden of Hazardous E-Cigarette Waste at Schools. My name is Hudson Kingston, and with me is Kira Hill. We're both attorneys with LPCC. LPCC is the Law and Policy Coordinating Center, and if you're not familiar with that, the Law and Policy Coordinating Center is a joint venture between the American Lung Association and the Public Health Law Center. We do support of tobacco control professionals in their work in ending commercial tobacco in the state of California. LPCC provides free technical assistance, research, training, and analysis to help communities pass strong local tobacco ordinances that are both effective and legally sound. So on our end, we work at the Public Health Law Center. It's actually in Minnesota, and this is a picture of our building and our beautiful parking lot in a month that's not February. We are located at the Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law on Dakota land, and we would love to have you come visit someday. Just to describe for people who are perhaps new to this concept, what we do is legal technical assistance, or what I'll be calling TA later in this presentation. That means we do legal research, we do policy development, model policies, things like that, implementation, defense. We work on publications. I'll be talking about several of those in my presentation. And we do trainings like this one. What we don't do is we don't take on clients or give them legal advice, and we don't lobby. So we don't go to legislatures or city councils and argue for or against a certain proposed policy. Instead, what we do is help you to make sure that the policy language you're working with is exactly what you want. And then you can take that and work with it how you will. So our plan for today, Kira and I will be talking about three main things. We'll be talking about the just sort of overview of the environmental impacts of e-cigarette waste, discussion of schools' responsibility to comply with hazardous waste laws, and Kira will be telling you more about policy solutions and schools that have engaged in litigation regarding e-cigarette waste. So we'll hopefully take you through the problem, the compliance issues, and then potentially the solutions and the ways to deal with compliance that end up leaving schools whole. Everything we do at the Public Health Law Center and LPCC is informed by our focus on health equity. So as you can see from this diagram, certain communities are not getting the resources they need in order to address the public health problems that are facing their communities. Perhaps they've been targeted by the tobacco industry, or perhaps they've been historically the victims of institutional racism. We think it's absolutely important that the type of work we're doing channel resources towards these communities first. So if you're talking about a rural school district, a low-income school district, perhaps a tribal school system, those are the jurisdictions that you as public health professionals can focus your attentions on, and perhaps lessons will be learned and models can be developed helping those communities that then get translated to other places. But I think it's very important to say that you can make choices to focus on working with communities that are especially targeted by the tobacco industry. In the context of health equity, it's important in this presentation to talk about environmental justice, which is a movement that started in the 1990s with the 17 guiding principles that were put out in 1991 at this first summit. I'm going to focus on 3 of them. There are 17. I encourage you to look at them all. First of all, number 6. Environmental justice demands the cessation of the production of all toxins, hazardous wastes, and radioactive materials, and that all past and current producers be held strictly accountable to the people for detoxification and the containment at the point of production. So what we're saying is, if an e-cigarette is hazardous waste and it can't be disposed of responsibly, that is the manufacturer's fault. That is not the school's fault. That is not the young person's fault for having that product. It's the person who made the hazardous waste in the first place is ultimately responsible for it. Furthermore, environmental justice is just generally opposes the destructive operations of multinational corporations. So some people talk about stakeholder processes and getting to a compromise where there's a solution that works for everybody. That's not on the table here. The tobacco industry does not have a seat at the table. They are not a stakeholder. Furthermore, the last one, number 17, environmental justice requires us to acknowledge that there are certain things that are billed as individual choice. And we know that addiction to nicotine is not really an individual choice, especially for young people or those who have been targeted by the tobacco industry. But you know, the individual choice to have unicorn vomit flavored e-cigarettes or even to sell blueberry flavored tobacco products, those are choices that people think that they should be allowed to have. But if it's destroying someone else's right to a safe and healthy life, then something's got to give, and individual choice sometimes has to change in order to achieve the environmental justice goals. So with all that said, I'll cover a few basic questions so that we're all on the same page, and then we'll sort of launch into it. So first of all, what is an e-cigarette? If you're on this webinar, you probably have an idea, but for the sake of our discussion today, it's really two things jammed together. So you've got the battery components, the circuit boards, the heating element, all of that is e-waste. All of that is made out of metals. You know, there's going to be various different plastics and synthetic materials going into it. All of that under California law is definitely e-waste, which is a type of hazardous waste. Then there's the e-liquid nicotine solution. That is going to also be a hazardous waste, a different type though. So you have your e-waste on one side, you have acute hazardous waste in the nicotine waste. So an e-cigarette really is a jamming together of two different types of what is, when it's disposed of, hazardous waste. Why do schools have so many of them? Well, if you work at a school or you talk to anybody who does, you know why. It's because young people are using e-cigarettes in epidemic numbers, and they're disposing of them at school, in the parking lot, in the bathrooms, wherever they can. You know, that's how addiction works. They don't stop using it just because they're at school. And unfortunately, with these products comes heavy addiction. So the other way that very often schools are getting it is through confiscation. So because of tobacco-free school policies, when someone is caught with one of these things, it gets taken away from them. So there's the stuff in the parking lot that's been disposed of and is comparatively light, but then there's also full containers of e-liquid nicotine, nicotine e-liquid or full e-cigarettes. And that becomes a very big problem because hazardous waste is judged on one metric based on how much it weighs. So if something's full, it's going to be a lot closer to the threshold for a significant issue. Third big question, how are they being disposed of? Well, largely they're being disposed of improperly. We have heard stories of people, like in this story, folks throwing them in the sink and destroying their JUUL as an act of defiance, throwing them out of the window into the ocean. People flush them down the toilet. Never flush an e-cigarette down the toilet. You are probably breaking laws, and also you're going to destroy that toilet. So there's a lot of ways that people have been disposing of them, and we're hoping that by getting this information out, people will stop doing that. We've also heard that schools very often are amassing large quantities of this stuff as they try to figure out the best way to deal with it. That's obviously more responsible than throwing it in the normal trash, but it does become a problem because, as I just said, the weight of the hazardous waste you have can be significant. If you get more than a kilo of nicotine waste, that changes your status under the law. Okay, I want to talk about two quick things before we get to our main event. And those two things are the larger impacts of e-cigarettes. They go far beyond the end product waste. And then I want to talk about tobacco product waste beyond just e-cigarettes. So please bear with me for a second. First of all, for e-cigarettes, yes, we're going to talk about how the end product waste is very dangerous and a very big deal under US law. But if you want to talk about the larger impacts of e-cigarettes, they are part of a global product chain that includes mining in Africa. It often seems to include growing tobacco in Africa or developing countries where human rights abuses in the tobacco industry specifically are rampant. So e-cigarettes have significant human and environmental impacts that go beyond what we're going to be talking about today. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But furthermore, you know, we're talking about e-cigarettes now. None of these tobacco product waste products are innocuous, right? Cigarette butts are the most littered product on the planet. They are highly toxic. They have thousands of chemicals leaching out of them. And as they degrade, they don't go away. They just end up in sea turtles, in food chains, and impacting various ecosystems. So cigarillo tips, they last a little bit longer. They're not recyclable, and they are equally toxic. So solutions to this whole problem will have to sweep up all of these things. And the good news is in California, you've already passed a law that's on the books, and it's called the Trash Amendments colloquially. It is an amendment to your Clean Water Act compliance. It's the first in the nation. And when it is finally implemented, which takes a very long time, jurisdictions will be on the hook for pretty big fines and other compliance issues if they don't capture all trash that is going into California's rivers, lakes, and into the ocean. So there is this looming requirement for jurisdictions, and if they don't come up with ways to limit single-use plastics and trash before it makes it into the water, this is what the solution is going to look like. And this is a costly solution. Jurisdictions could save a lot of money by thinking further upstream and dealing with things like cigarette butts or e-waste or things like that before they end up in these nets. This is just an example of what's in there right now. I mean, it's not just tobacco products. Obviously, there's a lot of single-use plastics in there of all sorts, but cigarette butts, cigarillo tips, and increasingly e-cigarette pieces and components are showing up in this stuff. And as I said, an upstream solution, as Kira is going to talk about more, is really the way to tackle this if you want to do it on the cheap and helping public health. But we're here to talk about e-cigarettes. This is our new friend, the Puff Bar, and they do have unique problems as waste. So a Puff Bar or a JUUL or what have you is going to have many types of toxic metals in toxic amounts. There's going to be remnants of nicotine, which is a highly effective pesticide. And when it spreads in water environments, it does kill marine life pretty effectively. As Kira is going to talk about a bit, these things explode and light on fire pretty frequently, causing millions, tens of $millions of damage in California alone. So there are unique issues about e-cigarettes that also make this more complicated and more of a big deal in a lot of people's view. So back again to the parts and pieces of an e-cigarette. This is the device. When I just talk about device, that's e-waste under California law. This is not recyclable. So one of the other ways that we've heard of that people are disposing of these is just chucking it in the recycling. Often that's going to cause a fire because it's going to explode and light a bunch of paper on fire. But also, you know, California has pretty detailed standards for recycling rechargeable batteries. This doesn't fall under it because you can't take the battery out safely. It's glued in there. You know, a older mod type e-cigarette where you can just pop the batteries out, those would fall under California's battery recycling law, but because of the way this is made, it cannot be recycled really. And this is hazardous waste as e-waste. Okay, and then on the other end of the spectrum, as I said, these are acute hazardous waste. This is under federal law. Acute hazardous wastes are very dangerous poisons. So on that list, you have benzene, you have DDT, you have copper cyanide. I mean, it's a long list, but it's all of the nasty things you know about and haven't heard of too. And nicotine has found its place on that list because of its historic use as a pesticide. We'll talk about the history a little bit more as I go on. But then the most important thing and why this has been complicated for regulators and for schools and for many people is that most of the products being sold right now are a combination of both. They are e-waste that contains an acute hazardous waste. So while the acute hazardous waste by itself could be reused or repurposed or destroyed fairly easily, the e-waste has to be treated in a different way, and there are different rules for both of them. So the legal sort of complexities of treating many of these e-cigarettes are going to be fairly deep. And because there are different types of e-cigarette products, it's important to segregate them into different groups so that you can treat them appropriately. Okay, so I'm talking about school policies. There's several at play here. I'm not going to talk about the custodial policies, but as we already discussed, one of the reasons that schools have so much of this stuff is obviously you have to clean up the parking lot or the bathroom when it's full of something that's actually a very dangerous product and an eyesore. There's the tobacco-free campus policies, which I think California excels at. And as a part of that, most schools are doing confiscation of tobacco products. That is a best practice. And then we're going to talk about hazardous waste policies at the school level. I mean, schools do generate hazardous waste already, solvents, gasoline, things that are going to be thrown away, paint, you know, these things. But because of the nature of this nicotine waste, it's a uniquely big problem, and also one that schools were not really prepared for. They didn't actually go out and buy the hazardous waste. So tobacco-free policies, obviously, you're probably all familiar with that in California. If you think that your school needs a little spruce on its tobacco-free policy, I would just want you to know that on our Public Health Law Center website, we recently have put out a model policy for schools, an FAQ on that model policy, and a discussion of alternative measures. I have alternative penalties here, but they really are alternatives to penalties, ways to get kids the help they need when they are addicted to these substances. So if any of that would be of help, please consult our website. We have a lot of information about it. Launching into hazardous waste, just a little history is helpful here. Since 1976, we've had a hazardous waste law in the US. It's the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. It's the law of the land in every state and territory. I'm going to call it RCRA from here on out, just because that's its short version. Since 1980, there's been an EPA list of hazardous wastes, and nicotine has always been on that list. In this original rulemaking, in the environmental document supporting it, they list nicotine among the acute hazardous waste, which, as I was saying, are extremely hazardous. And they found that exposure to these wastes have resulted in death and injury to organisms, the dispersal of hazardous materials, the degradation of aquatic, terrestrial, and atmospheric environments. It's pretty serious stuff, and we've had it under control for a long time now, but this is the level of pollutant we're talking about. The question mark on this slide turns to an exclamation point on the next one, because in 2015, we got confirmation from the EPA that e-cigarettes are absolutely hazardous waste as an acute hazardous waste, consistent with that 1980s listing. So in response to an attorney from Michigan, the agency concluded that because e-cigarettes include nicotine, which is the sole active ingredient in e-liquid, they are going to continue to be a listed acute hazardous waste. This was before the FDA deemed e-cigarettes to be tobacco products, but in 2019, after deeming, EPA again confirmed in a rulemaking that based on the toxicity of nicotine and no proof to the contrary, e-liquids were going to remain listed as an acute hazardous waste. So this is after FDA has deemed them to be tobacco products, but EPA has made it clear that FDA has not controlled the amount of nicotine in e-cigarettes. They've not determined any of them are safe for use. There's no evidence that FDA is doing the rigorous oversight over these products that would be required for EPA to determine that they were no longer dangerous in this manner. So they said, you know, in direct response to the vaping industry, this continues to be a dangerous pollutant and subject to our standards. So in summary, 1980s, nicotine is a listed acute hazardous waste. 2015 reconfirmed that e-liquids, it covers it. And 2019, only 1 year ago, almost to the day, EPA again confirmed it. So what's the big deal? Now that we know it's hazardous waste, and I've beat that over your head, what should a school do about it? Well, guidance from state agencies has come out on this topic. It's been slow, and I think it's mainly because it's such a complicated issue, and because, like I said, it's a combination of different types of waste. So this guidance from Minnesota was one of the first ones that I'm aware of that came out, and it covers nicotine wastes at vaping businesses, you know, at places that are selling 100% e-liquids and vaping stuff. So this one doesn't directly apply to schools, but it was one of the first ones that came out. More recently, Colorado has put out a guidance document that is for businesses, government agencies, and schools. So this is really targeted at people who are amassing this stuff, who aren't doing business in it and have just a bunch of waste on their hands and don't know what to do. And I would say that this is a very useful resource. I'll tell you how you can get a hold of it in a few slides. But just in summary, and this is a long list, many things are covered in this guidance. So Colorado talks about weighing the waste to determine what type of generator you are. Either you can be a small generator or a very large generator, and that's a weight based on how much you accumulate in a month. Registering yourself as a hazardous waste generator, storage, which is many requirements, you know, using the right containers, doing the right kinds of record keeping, checking on the materials. You know, some of them explode and light on fire, while some of them are highly toxic, so they need to have different storage techniques, and they need to be checked on pretty regularly. Contracting with a transporter to take the stuff away. You can't yourself deliver your hazardous waste away as a large or small generator. Planning for emergencies, you know, when a fire occurs or if there's a spill, what to do. Training your staff in both emergency and normal handling of this dangerous waste. Maintaining records per what type of generator you are. Satellite accumulation is the accumulation of the whole school district of all the waste in one location, which is allowed, but it has its own requirements. And then, and as I've already talked about, treating the e-waste that can be separated from the nicotine differently under the specific rules for that stuff. And there's even more covered in this guidance. I didn't want to bore everybody with a page-by-page discussion, but this is an idea of the sort of things you have to get through in order to make sure that you're complying with the law. It's important to say that California implements this law a little bit differently than Colorado. It has a robust and complicated system, and there will be some differences between that guidance and what is applicable in your jurisdiction. There are two authorities that you can go to talk about that. There's the statewide Department of Toxic Substances Control, and your county is likely going to have a certified unified program agency. So those are the county level agencies that deal with hazardous waste issues and hazardous waste compliance. You're also going to have very likely a household hazardous waste facility, but because a school is not a household, it's not a residence, the waste that you're collecting at your school is not appropriately brought to a household hazardous waste facility. Those people might have some ideas and some advice, but you shouldn't be bringing your stuff there. You should be contracting with an actual transporter. And the reason that I think that it's important to know about these two agencies, the statewide and the county level, is because they have some great resources that are available now. So for example, DTSC on its website has this list of hazardous waste transporters. It's broken down by every county. You can search for the companies in your area that are legally allowed to take the waste from you. So that's just one example. Obviously, that's just one step in the whole process, but they have a lot of resources like that that are available and can help with those steps that are sort of outlined by the Colorado guidance. So, brass tacks, what should a school do to comply with the law? Right now, DTSC doesn't have a statewide Colorado or statewide California guidance. So you are left with sort of a multi-step process of trying to figure out what to do. There's different ways to go about it, but you know, it's important to know that this is a federal system. So the EPA sets a minimum standard, which is at least as much as needs to be done in California. California can have better standards, they can have different standards, but they have to be as protective as the EPA standards. So the Colorado guidance does a really good job of laying out what the federal standards are, but it is not the exact law of California. We also put out a federal guidance document, which I'll show you on the next slide. It'd be great to communicate with those two agencies you have access to, your county level and statewide agencies. And then also here at the Public Health Law Center, LPCC, we can provide you with particularized technical assistance or TA on your questions. So please come to us with any questions you might have and we'll try to help you through it. Like I said a second ago, we did a publication in December last year talking about the federal standards and things that schools should start thinking about when they want to comply with the federal hazardous waste laws. That's available on our website, and I believe it's linked to on this webinar, so you should be able to get it when the recording pops out. It covers the federal standards. Again, it's not California specific, but it's definitely a good starting point and has a lot of details that you might find helpful. It also, the first resource linked to at the end of this document is that Colorado guidance. So if you want to find the Colorado guidance, I suggest you check out our publication first, and it's in there. Okay, and handing it over now to my colleague Kira Hill.
Great, thanks so much, Hudson. So as Hudson said, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the specific problems schools are facing when it comes to vaping waste. and then some other options that they have when they're trying to address those problems. So I'm mostly going to talk about litigation, but I do also want to briefly mention both the importance of complying with hazardous waste laws, as well as the impact sales restrictions can have on limiting access to these products, and therefore the amount of discarded products that end up in schools. So let's go over the problem again. As many of you know, the accumulation of large amounts of vaping waste in schools isn't a hypothetical scenario, it is really happening. This is a photo taken at a Bay Area high school by a researcher named Jeremiah Mock as part of a recent study addressing this type of tobacco product waste found in Bay Area high school parking lots. It depicts e-cigarette waste collected from one high school parking lot in just one day. And here's a photo of all the different types of devices collected by a school principal at Ramona High School. If you look closely, you can see that they're even collecting vials of e-liquid. There are newer generations of refillable products on the market that are smaller, sleeker, so these types of products are not going to be going away anytime soon. And as Hudson also mentioned, this is a puff bar, which is just another iteration of the type of disposable product that is likely to keep showing up. Puff bar has allegedly stopped distribution, according to recent reports, but imitation products are likely to continue proliferating. And why are these disposable and refillable products likely to make more frequent appearances? Well, this is largely because, as many of you know, FDA recently issued guidance indicating that pod and cartridge-based flavored e-cigarettes like JUUL, other than menthol and tobacco flavor, may no longer be sold until those products apply for and receive marketing orders from FDA. The guidance does not apply to disposable products like puff bar and its imitators, nor to refillable mod or tank systems and the refill liquid. The proliferation and continued evolution of these products highlights why compliance with hazardous waste laws is important for the protection of students, workers, and everyone else who handles these products. Additionally, failing to comply is not cheaper than complying, as penalties for violating hazardous waste law can go up to nearly $75,000 per day. And as Hudson mentioned, nicotine is a listed acute hazardous waste under federal law. EPA defines an acute hazardous waste as a waste that has been found to be fatal to humans in low doses or is otherwise capable of causing or significantly contributing to an increase in serious, irreversible, or incapacitating reversible illness. And as Hudson was also saying, EPA engaged in a rulemaking about a year ago where it noted that the monthly number of poisonings associated with e-cigarettes increased by almost 1,500% from January 2012 to April of 2015. Additionally, because refill e-liquid is available in highly concentrated forms, it is likely to result in more severe toxic effects because it is absorbed rapidly by the body when it comes in contact with the skin. This means that those products need to be handled carefully, and handlers must carefully avoid contact with their skin. And finally, EPA pointed out that it does not have adequate information or certainty to conclude that these nicotine-containing products will not pose risks similar to those present when nicotine was originally listed as an acute hazardous waste, particularly because FDA has failed to impose controls on the concentration of nicotine in e-cigarettes and in e-liquid, or even approve the products at all. Furthermore, burn and explosion injuries are also a risk, given the possibility that the batteries explode. One study found that explosions from e-cigarettes sent over 2,000 people to the ER over a 2-year period, which of course doesn't account for the people who didn't go to the ER for their injuries. And explosions and fires are a real problem in school, as evidenced by the 2 studies on this slide. The takeaway here is that ignoring the problem is not going to make it go away. The best outcome for public health is most certainly complying with hazardous waste law. And next, another potential option that can help reduce this particular strain on school resources is preventing these products from getting into the hands of kids in the first place. While schools are of course not in the position to enact their own legislation, they can support local efforts by elected officials and advocates in enacting these types of restrictions. So what do tobacco product sales restrictions look like? The most effective is a complete ban on the sale of tobacco products similar to that enacted in Beverly Hills and more recently in Manhattan Beach. Sales restrictions can also take the form of flavored product sales restrictions. In order to be most effective, these restrictions should include menthol and tobacco flavored e-cigarettes as well as menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars and little cigars. Flavored products are far and away the most preferred products among young people, meaning that unless all flavored products are prohibited, kids will continue to use them. And as Hudson mentioned earlier, sales restrictions can also be tailored to address environmental impacts caused by these products by, for example, prohibiting the sale of single-use plastics. Importantly, the Federal Tobacco Control Act specifically preserves the ability of states, tribes, and localities to enact their own sales restrictions. Considering schools can't have much of a role in actually restricting the sale of products, let's turn to what some schools have actively done to combat the vaping crisis. Specifically, let's talk about litigation. I'm going to discuss the schools that have sued JUUL and its affiliates so far. I'm then going to talk about the type of relief that those schools seek. And then I'm also going to talk about some other examples of litigation that have used similar legal claims to recover on behalf of a whole group of people who have been harmed by a product. And first, I do just want to remind you, as Hudson mentioned at the outset, that the Public Health Law Center does not represent clients, nor do we lobby. We aim to provide educational materials to the public in order to advance what we see as a collective mission to improve public health and further health equity. If you seek legal advice, please seek out an attorney that is licensed in your jurisdiction. So with that, let's review what has happened so far. In California, there are a number of school districts that have already sued JUUL, either on their own or as part of a class action suit. Those schools include large districts like Los Angeles and San Diego that represent hundreds of thousands of students, as well as smaller districts like Rockland. These schools have sued in both state and federal court and are represented by a number of different law firms and attorneys. An attorney from one of those firms, which represents San Diego, King City Union, Chico, Campbell Union, Davis, and others, stated in a press release that he views JUUL as, quote, the schoolyard bully that preys on our kids. In other words, this is a collective fight against a powerful corporation that has taken advantage of vulnerable members of our communities. As many of us are all too aware, this theme is one that has pervaded the world of commercial tobacco since its inception. And similarly, Rockland Unified School District Superintendent expressed the need for all school districts to come together and hold JUUL accountable for its actions. LA Unified School District's superintendent also expressed a need to hold JUUL accountable for its role in disrupting the school's main function of educating students. As past experience with big tobacco has also shown, litigation can be a powerful tool, particularly when taken on by representatives of the public. So what do these school districts seek to achieve by suing JUUL and its affiliates? Well, first of all, they seek what's called injunctive relief and abatement remedy to combat the e-cigarette epidemic, which has severely impacted the school districts by interfering with their normal school operations. The districts are also seeking compensatory damages to provide relief from the district's already incurred financial losses as a result of having to divert resources away from their educational missions. Instead, they've had to put funds towards everything from hallway monitoring to installing vaping detectors to dealing with expensive plumbing issues, as Hudson mentioned, to hiring additional staff, to asking teachers to work on the weekends to help students who've fallen behind due to the behavior and health issues that come with addiction. These schools have also incurred costs to develop outreach and educational programs for students and parents dealing with addiction and all the health problems that come with vaping. And in the best case scenarios, they have recognized that existing penalty schemes are ill-equipped to deal with the vaping crisis. So they've developed alternatives to penalties that focus on helping students rather than suspending them for violating tobacco product restrictions. And when it comes to injunctive relief and abatement, possible remedies extend beyond being compensated for the expenses and losses that the school districts have already incurred. Under a legal principle called public nuisance, courts have the ability to craft more forward-thinking remedies. Public nuisance is, briefly, an embodiment of the common law principle that people have the right to use and enjoy their communities without the unreasonable interference from others, or in this case, corporations. Public nuisance is useful in abating, or in less legal terms, remedying anything that unreasonably interferes with the health and safety of a community, and it was historically used to address things like pollution. Environmental laws have been put in place to make sure people are somewhat better protected, but there are many instances where public nuisance is still a very useful tool. So let's look at a few examples of situations where public nuisance is still a useful claim. I'm going to discuss two recent examples that have been particularly instructive in the context of opioids and lead paint, and then I'm going to discuss the state of California's own lawsuit against JUUL. So the first example is opioids. In August of 2019, an Oklahoma district court judge found that under Oklahoma's nuisance law, Johnson & Johnson had intentionally and misleadingly marketed their products as safe and effective for the treatment of long-term chronic pain. The judge stated in his opinion that Johnson & Johnson's false, misleading, and dangerous marketing campaigns caused addiction, overdose deaths, and neonatal abstinence syndrome, and further stated that these unlawful acts that annoy, injure, or endanger, these were unlawful acts that annoy, injure, endanger the comfort, repose, health, and safety of others. So as a remedy, the judge ordered Johnson & Johnson to pay $572 million to fund the first year of a very detailed abatement plan that would provide addiction services, counselors and investigators, and a myriad of other needed services and personnel to deal with the opioid crisis. The case is being appealed, but its remedy provides a useful example of the type of remedies that can be crafted to abate a public nuisance. And an example from a little closer to home involves lead paint. In 2000, the state of California brought an action against 3 paint companies alleging that they promoted the use of lead paint in homes built before 1978, knowing it was a public health hazard, and thereby creating substantial and unreasonable interference with the public right. In this case, the public right was the social interest in the safety of children in residential housing. As part of the abatement plan, the companies were required to pay for lead inspections, fund educational programs about lead hazards, and remediate older homes. While a 2017 appellate court ruling narrowed the lower court's ruling, so it only applied to homes built before 1951, and the case ultimately did settle, it nevertheless establishes precedent for municipalities and counties and even school districts to hold corporations accountable for the societal ills they knowingly create. It also highlights that in California, public nuisance requires showing that the company knowingly created or assisted in the creation of the interference with the public right. And like the school districts that have filed suit, the state of California has brought its own case against JUUL and its affiliates. Among other things, the complaint alleges that JUUL created a public nuisance by intentionally targeting youth, by using flavored products, sponsoring events, seeking out influencers and marketing on social media, and it also knew the particularly addictive nature of its products due to the special nicotine salt formulation it created. But it didn't warn consumers that its products contained nicotine until at least 2017. It also knew that youth were buying its products and driving its sales, but continued to sell them anyway, including online, where the state alleges JUUL intentionally flouted age verification requirements. The complaint contains more detailed information that's definitely worth checking out, so we've included a link on our website. And then particularly relevant to our discussion today, the state of California's complaint also discusses the unique harms experienced by schools at the hands of JUUL. In its allegations, the state lists many of the same injuries described in the schools lawsuits, which include absenteeism, disruptions, suspensions, loss of class time, nurse visit increases, funding and resource diversions, and other harms. And then the complaint also discusses how JUUL created a public nuisance through the way in which it disposed of and then encouraged its consumers to dispose of JUUL waste items, which include JUUL devices, pods, and chargers. So as we've discussed today, the complaint acknowledges the acutely hazardous nature of nicotine and notes that nicotine can be absorbed through the skin and is fatal to humans in low doses. It also explains the transportation and disposal of nicotine waste items is highly regulated, and it further notes that even empty JUUL pods still contain nicotine, as not all of the liquid nicotine is aerosolized before it's replaced by the user. The state's complaint also notes that JUUL devices contain lithium-ion batteries, which I mentioned before present a danger to the public because they can self-ignite when they're crushed, punctured, ripped, or dropped, and then are considered presumptively hazardous. And the complaint goes even further by calling out JUUL's role in creating a myth that JUULs were safe by telling customers both at sampling events and on their website to throw the JUUL pods away in a regular trash can. In fact, the state alleges that JUUL even failed to provide appropriate disposal options at its own offices, and JUUL itself improperly handled and disposed of JUUL waste items, including devices, pods, and chargers that were returned as defective. In its requested remedies, the state asks that JUUL be ordered to abate the nuisance it has caused, in addition to a number of other monetary and non-monetary remedies. As we saw from the earlier examples, an abatement plan can be far-reaching and include much-needed services like funding for counseling, personnel, educational campaigns, and potentially even the cost of proper disposal. And while we don't have time to talk about all of the complaints filed by the school districts, I do want to call attention to one in particular filed by the Los Angeles Unified School District. Its complaint, like the other lawsuits we discussed, alleges JUUL created a public nuisance due to its unreasonable and substantial interference with educational environments across the state of California. In LA in particular, the strain on resources includes almost 500 critical incidents relating to vaping and 1,000 LAPD responses related to vaping. The bathrooms can't be used as designed due to smoke, and smoke detectors cannot detect the smoke from e-cigarettes, which requires costly upgrades. Vaping has also led to absences due to sickness and behavioral changes, which has in turn resulted in the loss of funding, which is directly tied to student attendance. Los Angeles has had to divert funding away from educational goals like lowering class size, improving technology, and providing academic support to students who are struggling. Instead, LA has created an internal task force, which is made up of counseling professionals, representatives from after-school programs, school policy and environmental health and safety experts, and others. And part of the charge of this task force happens to include developing a procedure for disposing of confiscated JUUL pods and other vaping paraphernalia, as well as developing and carrying out a protocol associated with the collection and disposal of vaping products. Like the state of California's complaint, the LA Unified School District's complaint is worth looking at and is similarly available on our website. At the end of the day, schools are all over the map when it comes to dealing with disposal, and most of the complaints don't discuss waste at all. While some schools like LA are in the process of developing a specific protocol, many are probably not even aware that these products cannot and should not be disposed of in the regular trash. And they need to be handled and disposed of as the hazardous waste that they are. With FDA's failure to make sure that new products do not enter the market before it has approved the sale of those products, as well as its failure to prohibit the sale of flavored, disposable, and refillable products, this problem is only going to continue and potentially worsen. So let's come full circle and go over the takeaways one more time. First, it is important to reiterate again that non-compliance with hazardous waste law is not an option. As we discussed, educators, parents, and students should be aware that the products that they are handling are hazardous waste and need to be carefully treated as hazardous waste. Secondly, sales restrictions truly can be effective in combating the sale of these products moving forward. And unlike FDA's recent lackluster effort, local sales restrictions can include all flavored products. And finally, some schools have turned to litigation to address these harms that have impacted the public as a whole in an attempt to hold corporations accountable for the problems that they've created. And of course, litigation can be a slow and resource-intensive process, and these are lawsuits against just one company and its affiliates. But they serve to highlight a step that some schools have taken to address the e-cigarette epidemic and the costs that they have been saddled with as a result. So with that, that's our contact information, and we will take some questions.
Okay, so we've got a few questions. Starting out of the gate, I'll read out loud the first one and I'll answer it. So please reiterate the steps schools can take to complying with hazardous waste law. I think it's important to take an approach similar to the way that the LA Unified School District is looking at it. It's really a process and a protocol that that the school district is going to have to work on. And I mean, it is true that both our resource on the FAQs for schools and the Colorado guidance will both be helpful in laying out sort of the checklist of things to do. It's also going to be based on California law and local requirements. And in addition to hazardous waste law, as Kira said, this stuff is very poisonous if it comes in contact with skin. So there are worker safety protocols as well. So staff training is going to be part of the whole system, you know, using gloves, storing it correctly, using the right kind of transporters. There's a long list of things to do, and there are some resources that we're going to post that can help you start on that process. Okay, second question, Kira. Are manufacturers tasked with the responsibility of taking back their e-cigarette waste?
No, they are not. They are not required to take back the waste, which causes much of the problem.
Yeah, so RCRA, the original law is about cradle to grave responsibility, but there is a problem here because these are consumer products. So right now there isn't law that requires them to take responsibility for their products, but it is something that can be done at various jurisdictional levels. See one you like.
Let's see, can tobacco companies be sued for business malpractice? I should mention that the public nuisance claims are one of a number of claims that both the school districts and the state has brought. So it has brought other claims that are related to false and misleading practices or representations. It has brought a number of racketeering claims, things like that. So public nuisance is not the only claim that they've brought, and that's a great question. And again, I would definitely suggest taking a look at both of the state and the LA Unified School District's complaint, because they have a lot of really interesting backgrounds too.
Yeah, outside of California, Chicago has sued many e-cigarette sellers under consumer protection laws. So there are ways to go after them.
And actually, yeah, that's also another.
Yeah,
another thing.
Yeah. Unfair trade practices. So yes, that does come up. Kira, are California cities required by law to have a toxic waste disposal plan?
I'm assuming that has to do specifically with nicotine, and no, they're not. That's has a kind of longer and complicated answer that we would be happy to talk about offline, but no, there is no specific requirement.
Yeah,
as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, and they do have to, as generators of hazardous waste, so say like the local city courthouse, or if there's a city courthouse, confiscates e-cigarettes, then they are required to have a plan for their own waste generation, but they don't generally do citywide plans. That said, they could pass ordinances about public nuisances. So they could get into this field, and there are some examples of local ordinances regarding public nuisances in California. Can you please remind us why e-waste is not considered household hazardous waste? That's a great question. So there are several things going on here, but an e-cigarette, when it is being used by an end consumer in a residence and it's being disposed of at the residence, can be considered household hazardous waste. E-waste is specifically a type of hazardous waste called universal waste. It is I believe under California law, it never becomes household hazardous waste, but it is treated differently than hazardous waste. So it can be transported by the person who generates universal waste, And then, so if you're a household person, you can bring the e-waste there. But if you are a school, you're an institution, and you're accumulating this waste, that remains hazardous waste. And you'll need to contract with the appropriate type of hauler for the nicotine waste, and then check with your local authorities about whether you can transport your own e-waste. It is possible that the rules will just be different for those two types of waste.
See, are manufacturers required to label the vaping products as hazardous or toxic to children the way that other toxic products or chemicals are? If this is a question about Prop 65, the answer is pretty much yes. Nicotine is a chemical that is listed under Prop 65, and JUUL has, at least at some point in time, had a Prop 65 warning on their products, but that is actually also one of the claims that the state has alleged, is the failure to properly label the products as well. Yeah, good question.
And then the FDA, the reason that there are large nicotine warnings on the products now is because of FDA's authority over labeling. So there are labeling requirements in addition to Prop 65, but that's probably the best example. Let's see, what additional cost would be for e-cigarette storage, as most schools are using their drawer and plastic bags? I'm not sure of the exact cost. I haven't priced it out, but we're talking about using several different storage vessels, because you want to segregate the waste, and then they are going to have to be, some of them, fireproof. They're going to have hard sides. So I mean, it is the sort of thing that would be worked out in a protocol. There might be specific California standards for like a metal box, or sometimes it's a box that can be you can put things into, but it won't like regurgitate the whole entirety of it. And I know that in Colorado, under that guidance, school districts are coming up with a school district-wide protocol. They're buying all the boxes together. They're sort of figuring out what the right storage system is, and then they're using the economy of scale to make sure that all of the schools in their district know that they're doing it that way now. Let's see. Let's see. Which one do you like here?
These are great questions. They're also
complicated.
Yeah, they're complicated. But let's see. What are the environmental impacts electronic smoking devices are causing? They're different from the consequences from traditional cigarettes.
I have some slides on this.
Yeah.
Stephanie, could you minimize the questions? Great. Okay. Please talk here.
So yeah, Hudson did go through some of the unique components of e-cigarettes, electronic smoking devices that make them very different from combustible cigarettes. So this slide in particular is talking about cobalt, which is in the batteries that are in e-cigarettes.
In JUULs. In all lithium-ion batteries.
The rechargeable products. And then also, obviously, the liquid nicotine that we've been talking about is, as we've mentioned, is an acute hazardous waste. And while there is still nicotine in combustible products, the nature of the amount that is present is pretty significantly different, but that isn't to say that that combustible products are don't have their own problems, some of which Hudson already mentioned.
Yeah, similar to the impacts on the users, they both have dangerous effects, but they can be a little bit different in the speed that the nicotine leaches out and affects the environment and other things. This slide is about the actual development of the gizmos, the fact that like an e-cigarette is going to be a shoddily made electronic product, almost all of them made in China, which means that there's going to be a lot of the externalities and pollution left over in China after they're made, mostly in the Shenzhen area. If I can get to the next slide. Yeah, so there have been recent lawsuits that have actually been filed on both the cobalt mines and the use of the international tobacco companies' use of child labor. In the first lawsuit, which is the one on the left that's filed in the US here, it's against major producers of tech products, all of whom have committed to not using child labor in their supply chains. I've checked on JUUL's website, they have no commitment of that type. So you know, to the extent that Apple, Google, Microsoft, Dell, Tesla, they are failing to keep child labor out of their supply chain, JUUL has no statement alleging that it's even trying to do that. BAT in this case is British American Tobacco, and they've been sued in London for wage theft, essentially, because they pay adults so little in Malawi that they know that it is inducing them to use their children as child labor. So both of these are major human rights claims, but they also, you know, have huge environmental impacts because, you know, the mines in the DRC, the production in Malawi is done at a cut rate level. Nobody's wearing safety equipment. They're using very harsh pesticides. And then, as we had in a very early slide, you know, recent reporting by Bloomberg anyway has shown that the nicotine liquid that's going into e-cigarettes is not coming on a whole from American farmers. So it's coming from somewhere else. That article suggested that it was places like Zimbabwe, which have major labor problems in the tobacco industry. So it might not specifically be Malawi, but currently the US has no prohibition on nicotine imports from Malawi. And Zimbabwe is not much better, unfortunately. So that's some of the differentiation. Obviously, the product line for cigarettes is not tremendously wonderful either, but these are additional problems about e-cigarettes. Okay, Stephanie, do you want to
Pull the questions back up?
Maybe go back to a less depressing slide? Let's see. Okay, what steps could health departments take to address this problem? I think that really what we're trying to say here is that the responsibility is going to remain with the school districts to figure out the problem, but obviously the health departments can come with the resources that we're talking about, you know, the comprehensive tobacco policies for schools, including addressing measures that actually get kids help. I mean, obviously, if students stop using e-cigarettes, then the waste problem will be curtailed to some extent. But then health departments can work with schools to find policies that work with them. They can bring those resources to schools, especially to schools that are under-resourced and might not be able to bring together a task force to work on this. And ultimately, it's through partnerships, both with environmental organizations, you know, non-traditional partners, and also by lending assistance to the schools that I think broader policy solutions are possible. So like what Kira was saying with sales prohibitions and other types of bigger policies that protect schools by keeping the products out of the hands of youth in the first place. What do you think, Kira?
I know that there is one question about resources and guidance available to inform solid waste programs about accepting small quantities of e-waste. I do think that as Hudson mentioned, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC, and then the local CUPAs are great resources for those types of questions, and their resources are not going to be limited to just nicotine or acute hazardous waste. So I would imagine they would be a helpful resource on that too.
Yeah, in California, the resources on e-waste disposal are going to be very, very robust. So check out the websites of those agencies. Maybe check out the website of your county's household hazardous waste facilities, because they might just have general explainers on how it's supposed to work.
And I think with that, we're out of time. So thank you very much for joining us. And again, this will be available on our website.
Yep, slides and recording available in less than 24 hours. Thank you.